Some poems by Tony Harrison, the radical classicist of Leeds. Tony Harrison, now in his 80s, is one of the major international poetic voices of the later decades of the 20th century. In the public imagination, he's usually grouped with Ted Hughes and Seamus Heaney as one of the triumvirate of famous post-war poets who spoke in non-metropolitan dialects of English and whose surnames began with H. And despite Heaney's exploration of the consequences of British rule in Ireland, none of these comparisons really does justice to Harrison's international horizons. My talk explores a selection of his poems and one of his films in an attempt to reveal his engagement with French, German, Italian, Czech, Russian and Black Caribbean cultures, as well as with English language poetry, class politics and the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome. He has a command of Latin, Greek and ancient history, including expertise in such arcane specialisms as papyrology, Greek lyric meter, the administration of the Roman Danubian provinces and Black Sea archaeology. And his classical scholarship is immeasurably superior to that possessed by almost all the great poets and translators of the late 20th century with whom he's routinely compared. Not just Seamus Heaney and Ted Hughes, but Michael Longley, Derek Walcott, Frank McGuinness, Timberlake Wertenbaker, John Silkin and Geoffrey Hill. His good friend Wole Soyinka did take Greek courses at University College Ibadan, but the only poets and translators of remotely equivalent proficiency to Harrison in actual classical scholarship are surely Anne Carson, Josephine Balmer and Alicia Stallings. In the late 1960s, Harrison had actually contemplated the possibility of an academic career for himself, with a specialism in the Augustan and 18th century responses to Virgil, and he published 2 academic articles on the topic. And a case could be made that his fascinations with earlier poetic receptions of classical literature, evident in the different versions of Marshall's Vesuvius epigram 4-4 in The Grilling, was a force in the emergence of the new interdiscipline of translation studies in the 1970s. In The Grilling, first published in the London Review of Books on the 6th of June 2002, we're offered a glimpse into Harrison's vision of a trans-historical republic of artists who are very much alive to him at a Dionysiac symposium. He's inspired by Tischbein's painting of Goethe in the Roman Campagna to imagine himself sitting at the foot of Mount Vesuvius, listening into their conversation. Tischbein sketches Harrison and recites, in Latin, Marshall's famous epigram on the devastation caused to Mount Vesuvius by the eruption which destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 CE. The 2 Germans improvised translations, we're told, but Harrison provides us with 3 translations into English. Thomas May's, then Addison's, then mine, he says. And his own reads like this. Vesuvius, green yesterday with shady vine, where the crushed grape gushed vast vats of wine, ridges Bacchus loved, and put before his birthplace nicer, Venus favoured more than Lacedaemon, and where satyrs stomped till now, and Herculaneum all swamped, engulfed by cinders in a flood of fire. Power like this, not even gods desire. Now, placing his own vital dates, his date of death still, thank heaven, still to be determined, Harrison is equating himself with both May and Addison, whose dates follow their translations. Harrison's version reveals several of his really recognisable trademarks, notably rhyming couplets and the intrusion of a very low colloquial word, stomped, into elevated classical subject matter. But it's a word in May's translation that gives the poem its title and unifies its twin themes of shattering disasters and applied heat. The Latin of the last line, nec superi volent hoc liquissus sibi, literally, nor do the gods want to be allowed this power, is translated by May, the gods are grilled that such great power they had. Harrison follows May's translation of vital dates with this explanation. Grill, as in to hurt, give pain. Grill, as in the groans of Sir Gawain does my heart grill. But grill as well has heat, and whatever gods there were have blistered feet. So, to illustrate May's verb grilled, meaning pained, Harrison cites an example from the A Winters of Artura, a medieval romance in alliterative Northern English rhyming verse, exemplifying yet another of his trademarks, a joy in flamboyant displays of erudition and historical lexicography. The poem also contains his customary wine theme and personal touch, expressed in his increasing inebriation, in his self-description as a life-affirming drinker. But it develops into a lament for the appalling destruction and fatalities caused by two further fire-related catastrophes in wine-producing communities. The catastrophes span history, from Bronze Age Greece to the Second World War. They are the eruption on Thera, or Santorini, that destroyed the civilization based at Knossos, and the dropping of incendiary bombs, which flattened Würzburg, killing more than 5,000 Germans on March the 16th, 1945. The carnage of World War II, the backdrop to Harrison's childhood, he has said provided him with his lifelong commitment to poetry. When watching newsreel footage of concentration camps in 1945, he asked himself how he could measure even simple pleasures against such images when the violent events of history seem to cancel out joy and meaning. So the grilling clarifies the nature of Harrison's classicism. It positions him as engaged in dialogues with the whole genealogy of poets going back via canonical German and English poets, including an early Arthurian author, to the Latin of Martial and even the Minoan Mycenaean civilization reflected in Homeric epic. It shows him revelling in his own control of classical languages, craftsmanship and erudition, but also explaining arcane, obscure references for a general reading public. And it also reveals him offering in glimpses of his personal lifestyle and personality while addressing terrible human suffering and issues of great public moment that underlie modern history and politics. Classic Society, Leeds Grammar School, 1552 to 1952. Harrison's poetry often confronts the long-standing attempts by the ruling classes, especially in Britain, to monopolise what they call the classical heritage or classical tradition. Several poems about his childhood explore this issue. Me Tarzan remembers the boy whose homework prevented him from playing in the streets with his friends. "A bloody cant of Latin prose," he yells out of his attic window, his head protruding, "like patriarchal sissy bleeding rose." Still recalls the confusion of a child getting grease on his translation of Xenophon because his father insisted the barber apply hair oil to his head. And Classic Society expresses the class tensions crystallised in the pedagogical exercise of Latin prose composition. We boys can take old Hansards and translate the British Empire into SPQR, but nothing demotic or up-to-date, and not the English that I speak at home. Learning to compose in the Latin language is part of the British imperial curriculum and inimical to the working class whose language his family uses. On not being Milton. My monograph on Tony Harrison is subtitled Poet of Radical Classicism. And in literature, the term radical classicism is intertwined with black classicism, which emerged in relation to African American authors' engagements with ancient authors and with the white ruling class invention of an American classical tradition in the cauldron of 18th century slavery debates. Key figures here are Phyllis Wheatley, Ralph Waldo Ellison and Toni Morrison. John Barnard's fine study, Empire of Ruin, Black Classicism and American Imperial Culture, 2018, historicises black classicism by analysing it in relation to the role of classicism in the dominant culture, reading it within and against the discourses of national identity that have served to reinforce racialised structures of power. And Harrison's radical classicism has done the same for the role of classicism in the British class system. But Harrison alludes something much closer to black classicism when he calls On Not Being Milton the 16 lines of the first poem from the School of Eloquence. He calls them my cahier d'un retour au pays natal, my growing black enough to fit my boots. One reason he is not Milton is that he identifies with the conflicted Odyssean Aimé Césaire in his prose poem Return to My Native Land of 1939. This Martinican intellectual trained as a classics teacher at the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, and the poem relates his quest for identity in Paris and back home. Césaire exploits the classical associations suggested by his black author narrator, who fears that his education has led him into complicity with white people, betrayal of his race. And now Harrison, after years in Africa in the 1960s, relates to victims of racism and colonial oppression abroad as much as to the working class of England. Summer Garden. 3 of the 5 Petrarchan curtain sonnets in the Loiners, located behind the Iron Curtain in what was then called Leningrad and in Prague, cities where Harrison spent time early in his career, they develop a contrast between public artefacts and private lovemaking. Summer Garden is set, ironically enough, in a wintry neoclassical Russian snowscape. Harrison reminds us of the devastating fatalities suffered by the Soviet Union in World War II and of the military heroism of the male populace commemorated in massive modernist statue groups. He reminds us of them by his image of Leningrad's vast pool of widowhood chipping away at the pavement ice. The same lonely women act as janitors in the city's public museums and amenities. They also guard the Rembrandts and rank gents who stand all day with stern, unbending gaze haloed with Tsars' crowns and Fabergés, their menfolk melted down in monuments. Leningrad is presented as one vast public cemetery where all the dead Soviet soldiers have metamorphosed from animate humanity into metallic sculpted friezes. And this anticipates the fascination with inscribed gravestones and cemeteries, which develops from the School of Eloquence and comes to full fruition later in V. These Leningrad monuments are grimly guarded by the dead Russian soldiers' bereaved womenfolk, themselves likened to metallic artefacts and associated with the even older Tsarist regime. Harrison implies these guards don't approve of the woman with whom he's walking around the Summer Garden. Between the statues Veritas, Honour and Psyche, whom strong passion made forget conditions of darkness and the gods' taboo. Now, for those of us who visited the Summer Garden, its avenues lined with baroque white statues of female personifications are here instantly recognisable. And for those who haven't, a similar scene is conjured in the mind's eye by the orthographic capitalisation of the statues' names, implying the lettering on plinths, on ancient inscriptions, and beneath public sculptures. Truth and honour in this poem's moral landscape contest the judgmental attitudes of the older women, who are the servants of a corrupt regime. But the statue of Psyche bending with her lantern to look at the sleeping body of her beloved Cupid serves another much more surprising purpose. This arresting statue group was created in the early 18th century from a design by Giovanni Lorenzo Bernini. But the ancient source is Apuleius' Latin novel Metamorphoses. Psyche and Cupid were secretly lovers despite the disapproval of Cupid's mother Venus. But Cupid banned Psyche from looking on his face. She broke the ban by using a lamp and woke him accidentally when a drop of oil landed on his skin, but suffered many ordeals in reprisal. And here in Harrison's poem, she transcends the conceptual divide between the inanimate matter of the public artefacts and Harrison's preoccupation with his lover. the conditions of darkness and taboo he experiences in Cold War Leningrad suddenly make him identified with the experience of the desirous stone psyche suffering under diverse prohibitions. And Harrison's persona now moves indoors. The artefacts in the fourth sonnet, the People's Palace, are the personifications Justitia and Pomona, justice and fruit harvest, closed from public view, and they are wired to a US import anti-theft device and secretively stored in crates viewable only by an academic and the ebullient man polishing the floors. The secrecy, paranoia and elitism which marked Leningrad life in the 1960s is conveyed with supreme economy in the concealment of the virtues both of moral justice and abundance of fruit. And that trope is later developed in its fullest form in a Kumquat for John Keats. V. Harrison's answer to human suffering is to frame horror, memory and emotions within strict verse forms. He's written a few fascinating prose essays, mostly as introductions to his poetry, but he's uncomfortable except when writing in metre. He said that he was originally drawn to verse because he wanted to occupy literature and learned it as skillfully as I could in order that people would have to pay attention. But he added that verse has a more primal source connected with the human life force. It's associated with the heartbeat, with the sexual instinct, with all those physical rhythms which go on despite the moments when you feel suicidal. And his poem on the metre expresses this in sonnet form. He wrote in 1964 that translating poetry into English verse would improve his own poems. I learned all the metres by imitation. It gives you a structure from which to venture out, like being on a trapeze but having a wire to catch you if you fall. And his sonnets reveal his absorption of exponents of the 14-line form from Dante to Yeats and Auden. But his chosen model in many poems, including V, is the 16-line sonnet of George Meredith's Modern Love. Harrison realised that double octets, alternatively divisible as 4 quatrains, allowed a stronger dialectic and therefore enriched potential for polemic, and he sometimes breaks the lines up differently to underscore the sense of an argument developing. On Not Being Milton, for example, is divided unevenly as 4-7-1-3-1 and printed as such. The sonic syncopation reflects the contrast between Miltonic formality and Harrison's theme of inarticulacy. Harrison's most famous work, V, was written during the National Union of Miners strike, which began in 1984, in protest against closures planned by the National Coal Board, and this long quatrain poem is now regarded as a classic of late 20th century literature. The V sign draws together football and the World War II victory sign. It symbolises divisions of class, gender, religion, language, and the conflict within Harrison's consciousness between the class of his birth and the circles that he now moved in. But V did not explode into the national consciousness until November 1987, when Channel 4 Television broadcast a film of Harrison reciting it, directed by Richard Eyre. The broadcast created public uproar, mostly focused on its 4-letter words. The programme involved the longest and densest cluster of sexually explicit words that had ever been broadcast in Britain at the time, and it made Harrison headline news. Mary Whitehouse protested in the Times. The Daily Mail was horrified, denouncing it as a torrent of filth. Gerald Howarth, a Conservative MP, had tried to have the broadcast banned, although he hadn't even read most of the poem. And he did that by tabling an early day motion in Parliament entitled Television Obscenity. The parliamentary rumpus of course ensured that a much larger audience tuned in, but the scandal obscured the reality that the aspect of V to which the right wing really objected was its resolute sympathy with the working class. A modern response to Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard of 1751, V recounts a trip made by Harrison to a cemetery in Beeston, Leeds, to visit his parents' grave. The graveyard is now a haunt of local football fan skinheads, and it's been defaced by obscene racist graffiti. This prompts meditation on the divisions, as in V for verses, caused by class, racial and other conflicts. These V's are all the versuses of life, from Leeds v Derby, black, white, and as I've known to my cost, man v wife, communist v fascists, left v right, class v class, as bitter as before, the unending violence of us and them, published in 1984 by Colboard McGregor and the NUM. There follows a ferocious dialogue on education, life chances and the purpose of poetry, and that's with a skinhead who speaks in Leeds vernacular. He turns out to be an alter ego of the poet himself. The quotation from the then NUM president, Arthur Scargill, that introduces V reads, "My father still reads the dictionary every day. He says your life depends on your power to master words. Poetry helps to compensate for inarticulacy." Harrison had heard earlier memorialised two uncles who struggled to speak in his signature poem Heredity. Joe and Harry, one was a stammerer, the other dumb. And he's written that these early experiences of family inarticulacy were what drove me, I see now in retrospect, into a passion for language and languages, and for what is still for me the supreme articulacy and eloquence of poetry. The poem V releases the voice of the poor youths of Leeds, in contrast with Gray's poem, in which the underclasses who might have had poetic talent but just remained agricultural labourers lie buried, mute and inglorious. In the sixth quatrain of V, Harrison reflects this cemetery may be his own last resting place. And there's the memory of his classical education at Leeds Grammar School and Leeds University. And that provides the first wide-angle frame for the cemetery. If buried ashes saw, then I'd survey the place I'd learned Latin and learned Greek and left. The places where Leeds United play but disappoint their fans week after week. The classical languages distinguish Harrison from the football fans. Their youth is spent on the football terraces rather than educational institutions. And Latin plays its part in class alienation again in quatrain 11, where a former mayor of Leeds is honoured by an inscription in a bit of Latin. Harrison contrasts himself as a classical poet with the beer-swilling underclass by capitalising the brand name of their favourite lager, Hop. But the next reference to classics is kept for the dramatic moment when the skinhead's voice erupts into the poem. Harrison sends himself up when the poet here pompously asks himself, using a Greek term rather than its obvious English equivalent, racist, and a completely unnecessary French one, why the Vandals write what they do. Are they giving the dead their xenophobic feeling, or just a cri de coeur because man dies? The skinhead snarls in response. So what's a cri de coeur, cunt? Can't you speak the language that your mum spoke? Think of her. Can you only get your tongue round fucking Greek? Go and fuck yourself with cri de coeur. The skinhead can't tell the difference between ancient Greek and French. The poem prompts us both to realise this and acknowledge our own intellectual snobbery in judging him for his ignorance. But the French is important. The classicism of V lies predominantly in its dialogue with canonical English poets, Gray, Wordsworth and Byron, but especially with Rimbaud, as Christine Regan has shown. Now, he was a communard and a poet of the commune. Harrison presents himself in V as an unlikely union of high cultural poet and dispossessed vandal, an idiosyncratic loner who finds his ghostly twin in a 19th century French poet. Harrison's jolted out of his elegiac reminiscing by a youth who tells him, "A book, you stupid cunt's not worth a fuck." The poet responds in the skinhead's own language. "You piss artist skinhead cunt, you wouldn't know, and it doesn't fucking matter if you do. The skin and poet united fucking Rimbaud. But the autre that je hais is fucking you." The poet thus embeds in the obscene Leeds patois. He's increasingly using himself, the alien French of Rimbaud's celebrated dictum, je hais un autre, I is someone else. The poem subsequently acts the dictum out when the cultured poet Harrison metamorphoses into an illiterate neo-Nazi vandal. The spray can wielding doppelganger air assault his name, and it was mine. But the skinhead forbids the poet to use languages he can't understand, which are collectively subsumed twice in one quatrain under the generic label Greek. I've told you, no more Greek. That's your last warning. I'll boot your fucking balls to kingdom come. They'll find you cold onto grave tomorrow morning, so don't speak Greek, don't treat me like I'm dumb. The poet makes no further classical references, but gradually morphs into the skinhead himself. In the opening quatrain, the authorial voice of V had addressed future readers with a meditation on Harrison's paternal ancestors and their trades. Next millennium, you'll have to search quite hard to find my slab behind the family dead. Butcher, publican and baker now me bard, adding poetry to their beef, beer and bread. Rather than call himself poet here, as he does on his passport, he chooses the resonant term bard with its Homeric and medieval associations. And this isn't solely for aural and alliterative reasons. Anthony Rowland has suggested that there's an Odyssean sensibility behind V, which tracks the poet's journey from his beeson youth to exile in the geographical specificities of North Leeds, and in which the skinhead appears as a kind of ghost in a libation scene that ironically invokes the spirit of the living poet. We could develop the parallels between Homer's Odysseus and this poem. Odysseus of the far-flung travels the increasing isolation, the wordless encounter with his own mother in the underworld, and the sense of the Leeds ghosts haunting the underworld maze of disused mining corridors, and the return to the hearth and bed of a much-loved woman from whom he fears he may be parted again. But ultimately, the poem is about Harrison's own problems with reconciling his vocation and his class origins and political views. He describes the vandalism described and enacted in V as that act of vandalism I would like to commit on English literature, and the desire to break out from the esoteric closed world of poetry. But he's still come no nearer to finding an answer to his own self-doubt, expressed in the vandal's assertion, "It's not poetry we need in this class war." A kumquat for John Keats. Voices themselves silenced and liberated, singing or speaking high poetry or obscenities, in regional or patrician accents, ancient and modern languages, are a continuous preoccupation in all his poems. In Them and Us, 1978, which even includes an ancient Greek sound of lament in the Greek alphabet, Harrison recalls how he was brutally interrupted when asked by his school teacher to recite Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. 4 words only of "me heart aches" and "mine's broken, you barbarian TW." He was nicely spoken. The following year, Harrison's regard for Keats became the springboard for the remarkable poem A Kumquat for John Keats. At the age of 42, Harrison tells us, after a year full of bile and self-defeat, he finds himself in the countryside of Florida and discovers the kumquat fruit. Eating one whole, skin and pulp together, produces a taste that is both sour and sweet at the same time. And for Harrison, now at midlife, it seems to symbolise the combination of bad and good, horror and ecstasy he's experienced. And it puts him in mind of the most well-known poem in English about the dialectical unity of life's polar emotional extremes, Keats' Ode on Melancholy. I, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has a sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. Keats had seen joy as a grape to be savoured, but only by people who can truly know what it is to be miserable as well. And Harrison fantasises about offering Keats a kumquat as a perfect image of this duality. But there are impermeable barriers between them. Keats died at the age of 25, whereas Harrison has lived into early middle age. More importantly, their lives are separated by a century of grim history. Years like an open crater, gory, grim, with bloody bubbles leering at the rim, a thing no bigger than an urn explodes and ravishes all silence and all odes. Flora asphyxiated by foul air unknown to either Keats or Lempriere. Dehydrated naiads, dryad amputees, dragging themselves through slagscapes with no trees. A shirt of Nessus fire that gnaws and eats children, half the age of dying Keats. Harrison has turned to Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn to ask whether there can be any kind of pastoral poetry at all after the invention of the nuclear bomb. Keats's Grecian Urn, a sylvan historian, a still unravished bride, preserves its silence about life in slow time during an idyllic pastoral past. But nuclear bombs detonate, and Harrison effectively makes Keats' ode explode itself into fragmented pieces, destroying pastoral assumptions about time. The flora of Keats' sleep and poetry had represented his early poems and their amorous pastoralism, but for Harrison, flora is asphyxiated by foul air unknown to Keats or Lempriere. That's the author of a classical reference work used by the Romantic poets. The white naiad in a rippling stream, who represents what a poet can perceive in his mind's eye in Keats to George Felton Matthew, is now dehydrated. The dryads are lulled to sleep by zephyrs, streams and birds and beads in Keats' Ode to Psyche, but they've become amputees, and the radiation figures as the shirt of Nessus, the robe anointed with the Hydra's poison, with which Danae accidentally kills her husband Heracles in Sophocles' Wound of Trachis, is Harrison's own grim addition to these rural classical personnel. He returns to the Ode on Melancholy when regretting that he can't, of course, offer Keats a kumquat, because dead men don't eat kumquats or drink wine, they shiver in the arms of Proserpine. Harrison puts a twist on Keats' admonition to his reader not to suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade ruby grape of Proserpine, with a dark allusion to a fruit of deadly toxicity. Gaze of the Gorgon. In the final sonnet of Curtain Sonnets, where the action shifts to a bitterly cold Prague on his birthday, April 30th, 1968, the day before the traditional May Day parade, Harrison broke new ground in his use of a sculpture. For the first time in his published poetry, in Prague spring, his own perspective is virtually fused with that of a stone visage. It belongs to a gargoyle depicted playing a lute in a nest of carved cherries high up the Gothic cathedral of St. Vitus. In the first quatrain, Harrison describes the gargoyle high up in the clouds. He seems to have been turned into stone with his mouth wide open, whether to scream, sing or vomit. A silent scream, the madrigal's top note, puking his wassail on the listening throng, mouthfuls of cumulus, then cobalt throat. Medusa must have hexed him in mid-song. And the trope of petrifaction became central to Harrison's thinking about the Greek tragic masque, and it unifies his film poem, The Gaze of the Gorgon. The gaze of the mask-like face of the decapitated Medusa is quite literally petrifying because it turns the viewer into rock. Harrison would later evolve the Nietzschean idea he found in The Birth of Tragedy, that Dionysiac art allows mass performers and viewers of tragedy to view unbearable suffering without being turned into stone. And the singing or screaming, not quite human, semi-grotesque gargoyle also foreshadows Harrison's later fascination with other semi-human cast figures. And The Gaze of the Gorgon of 1992 is a 49-minute film about the wars that scarred the 20th century, and it veers from sounds of sights of exquisite beauty to the most harrowing footage in his work. It includes a soprano performance of Elite by Schumann and lingering close-ups of delightful sculpted muses, but these are intercut with clips and still photographs from both World Wars and the Gulf War of 1990-1, codenamed Operation Desert Shield. The director was Peter Symes, with whom Harrison had established a deep creative understanding. And the central image is the face of the Gorgon on the temple pediment of the Temple of Artemis in Corfu Archaeological Museum. And in Harrison's only extended engagement with Homer, the most important co-text is the Iliad. And in another unusual move, although he is, of course, the voice speaking the poetry, it's put into the mouth of the German Jewish poet Heinrich Heine. The motifs of war, the Iliad, Heine and Germany are connected by the moment in 1911 when men digging for Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had a summer palace in Corfu, exhumed the terrifying Gorgon sculpture with which Wilhelm became obsessed. This man likened Jews to a poisonous fungus on the German oak, and he even made drawings which appear in the film proving that the Gorgon's strange posture was modelled on the swastika. The palace had been built in 1890 for Empress Elizabeth of Austria, affectionately known as Sissi. It was called the Achilleon because it was a monument to the Iliadic hero. And Harrison discovered the statue there of Heine, whom the culture vulture Sissi had invited to live as a guest with her when he was ill with VD. That statue was taken down by Wilhelm because Heine was not only a political radical, but Jewish. Get rid of Sissi's syphilitic yid. Damn it, the man's a Democrat. I've got no time for shits like that. The Gorgon represents all agents who cause human suffering through the brutality and machinery of war. The central idea is that the Gorgon's gaze, which turns living being into stone, returns cyclically to petrify entire races and continents. While the film was in development, Harrison was also working on his play about the invention of chemical weapons, square rounds, echoes of which can certainly be heard in the Gorgon snake hissing like chlorine gas at Ypres. In 1991, he also wrote A Cold Coming in response to a shocking photograph from the Gulf War. The film includes a distressing sequence showing the faces of disfigured or dead soldiers, the Kaiser's Gorgon choir, who are turning into stone and grunting to the barbed wire lyre. And this contrasts with the tragic masks of ancient days held by a dainty statue of Melpomene, the tragic muse who used to help humans contemplate their predicament. The film meditates on the dialectical connection between masks and death. In ancient Greek thought, the gaze of the Gorgon, the archetypal mask head, was literally lethal because it turned the viewer into stone. The opening frame consists of a quotation from Simone Weil's The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, presciently written in 1939 during the Nazi occupation of France and the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War. And it reads, "To the same degree, those who use force and those who endure it are turned into stone." As Henry Stead pointed out, the Jewish Vey also identifies the death of Hector as an example of the extreme force that turns humans into material objects by killing them. Exercised to the limit, it turns man into a thing in the most literal sense. It makes a corpse out of him. The hero becomes a thing dragged behind a chariot in the dust. And the bitterness of such a spectacle is offered to us, absolutely undiluted. And in Harrison's film, the abuse of Hector's corpse is key. It's painted on a large fresco in the Achilleon, France matches Triumph of Achilles, commissioned by Sissi in 1892. And while the camera first surveys it, Heine comments, "Along with me, the Empress versifier revealed blind Homer and his lyre, the ancient poet whose Iliad was the steadiest gaze we've had at war and suffering." The next visual image is the statue of Achilles which Wilhelm commissioned, where Sissi's Achilles statue, Dying Achilles by Ernst Helter, showed the superhero suffering and prostrate. Wilhelm's Triumph of Achilles by Hannes Goetz of 1909 is a terrifying upright hot plate with a gorgon carved on his shield and the inscription, "The greatest German to the greatest Greek," on its plinth. But then the camera returns to the painting to linger not on Achilles or on his chariot, but on the women of Troy, especially Andromache, fainting at the sight of her husband's cadaver. The soon-to-be defeated rows of Trojans watch exultant foes who bring the city to the ground, then leave it just a sand-blown mound. These verses correspond with specific passages in the Iliad. Andromache's crazed dash to the walls when Achilles has killed Hector in Book 22, and the simile of the boy kicking down a sandcastle in Book 15. The poet concludes the commentary on this painting with a return to the parallels between the Holocaust and the destruction of Troy, remembered only because of Homer. A whole culture vanished in the fire until redeemed by Homer's lyre. A lyre like Homer's could redeem Hector's skull's still echoing scream. Yet, as Simone Weil insisted, the victorious Greeks were also in the Gorgon's gaze. Both victims and victimisers are dehumanised by acts of atrocious violence. People with religious or political views of rigidity have been looked upon by the Gorgon too. The bulk of gaze of the Gorgon is filmed in the Achilleon, but it has a vast historical and geographical sweep like all Harrison's work. It opens in Frankfurt, where a modest memorial to Heine is compared with huge imposing statues of Goethe and Schiller. Young drug addicts, contemporary victims of the Gorgon, shoot heroin into their veins. And towards the end, the scene shifts to the Bronx in New York, where African and Hispanic Americans dance joyfully beside the Heinrich Heine Memorial. This white marble fountain was designed for his home city of Düsseldorf to mark the centenary of his birth in 1897, but anti-Semitism put a stop to that plan. Its sculptor, Ernst Herter, took it to the USA. And the American reference leads into the final sequence of horrific images of charred Iraqi corpses in a burnt-out tank, with the Gorgon's face superimposed, as caused by Operation Desert Shield and also inspiring A Cold Coming. These aren't the first or even the most shocking images in the film. The newsreels from the mass graves of World War I and the concentration camps of World War II are breathtakingly dreadful. Perhaps the most shocking clip follows close-ups on the Achilleon's graceful terpsichore, Muse of the Dance. It shows a shattered human foot being amputated. And this immediately follows some of the most memorable verse in the film, illustrating perfectly Harrison's radical classicism's fusion with transhistorical and international vision. It's recited over a beautiful carved image of a particular type of ancient lyre. The barbitos, the ancient lyre, since the Kaiser's day, is restrung with barbed wire. Bards' hands bleed when they play the score that fits an era's scream. The blood, the suffering, the loss, the 20th century scream is played on barbed wire barbitos. Harrison's sensitivity to the ideological messages transmitted by public art and sculpture was already a pronounced feature of his first big collection, The Loiners, but the work which conducts his most succinct analysis of the class politics of the visual reception of antiquity is surely The Gaze of the Gorgon. Harrison's most condensed reception of the Iliad is also his most intense engagement with the way classical and classicising visual images have been abused by the emperors, tyrants and racists who took the poor working classes of Europe into two catastrophic world wars.